Okay, so it's just past 10 o'clock, and I think we should start today's session. And so I'm going to be introducing you to the chair and the panelists, and just want to say thank you so much for joining us today at Rosa's Summer Conference 2021. We are delighted that almost 700 people have signed up to the event over the next 2 days, and it feels extremely positive to welcome so many organisations from the women and girls sector, from the funding sector, and also from partner charities and organisations. My name is Rebecca Gill. I'm the Executive Director of Rosa, and I've been in post since April last year. I'm extremely grateful to one of our key funders, Cummins, who have enabled today's event to take place. I have worked in and around the UK women's sector for over 20 years and know some of you from that time, and others of you I have come to know more recently through Rosa, and some of you I've met yet to meet either online or even in person. I'm really proud that Rosa has been able to bring all of us together after such a challenging and difficult time. Exactly 15 months ago today, the UK entered its first lockdown, and we faced deeply uncertain times. But as ever with organisations led by and for women and girls, our sector faced the challenge with innovation and determination to support women and girls who faced harassment, discrimination, homelessness, destitution, violence and abuse, and no recourse to public funds. We saw organisations moving services online, delivering essential support and provisions door to door, and offering support over the phone at all hours of the day and night. We saw many of you reworking helplines to run from kitchen tables and gathering data and evidence to provide influential reports about women's lives during lockdown. You did this week in, week out throughout the year. And so many of you did this whilst homeschooling kids, caring for relatives, nursing sick people with COVID-19, and in many, many cases, experiencing enormous personal grief and bereavement. Every single woman here today who leads or works in a women's organisation deserves all the medals and prizes that this country can bestow. And instead, so many of you face burnout, exhaustion, and an endless cycle of funding crises. And this has got to stop. Rosa exists to resource and champion and connect the women and girls sector across the UK. We know you need more money, more support and more space to be heard so you can meet the needs of women and girls in our country. We will always do everything we can to meet that need and to encourage others in the funding sector, the private sector and in national and local government to do the same. And this year has also seen huge moments which have shaped our lives. The horrific and public death of George Floyd challenged so many of us to confront the profound and often lethal impact of racism on people of colour every moment of every day. It has forced so many of us, particularly white people and white-led organisations, to hear the alarm bell of racism that has been ringing for centuries and to commit to respond to that in all of our work. There is no excuse now for funders, for charities or for organisations to pretend that we don't know or we can't see the way racism manifests itself every day for so many people. The continuing and profound epidemic of male violence against women came to public prominence at the start of lockdown, when the risks to women of being locked down with violent partners was realised by politicians and the wider public. It is thanks to the efforts of so many women's organisations, many of whom are on our panel today, that an improved and strengthened domestic abuse bill received royal assent in April this year. However, alongside coercive control, economic abuse and the physical violence that so many women and girls suffer at the hands of men, by the end of 2020, we know that 107 women have been killed by men. And in March this year, we learned of the horrific kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard. And we know that a further 41 women have been killed by men since Sarah's murder. All of these women mattered, and we remember them and their families, including women like Mina Smallman, who is currently sitting through the trial of the man accused of murdering both of her daughters, Nicole and Deeba, last June. Rosa will always continue to work with organisations that address male violence against women and girls. And we are privileged to have been the recipient of the funding raised by Reclaim These Streets, which we are using to build a fund which we will distribute to women and girls organisations working to address male violence in all its forms. Over the next month, we'll be awarding grants through our Thrive Fund, which we've run in partnership with Smallwood Trust, and which has been funded by the government's Tampon Tax Fund. And later this year, we'll be launching a fund to support organisations led by and for Black and minoritised women and girls, building on our COVID-19 response work. But we know that whatever we raise and distribute, it is small fry compared to what you need. And this conference provides us all with an opportunity to share our experiences of the past year and before, and to acknowledge the challenges so many of you have faced as individuals as well as organisations, to remember that you do not face these challenges alone. We are delighted to have such a great range of speakers over the next 2 days, and we thank you all for coming. This is our moment to celebrate all that we have in common and to strengthen our sector to face the future together. And with that said, I am delighted to welcome you all to our first session, Standing Strong, Resilience and Innovation in Times of Crisis. This is an opportunity to hear from some incredible women from organisations that do so much to support women facing the challenges I've outlined above. I'm delighted also that we are joined by Sirin Kale, feature writer for The Guardian, whose investigations led to the revelations of serious sexual misconduct allegations against the actor Noel Clarke. Sirin will be chairing today's session. The session is due to end at 11:20 in time for the next session starting at 11:30. All the audience videos and cameras are off, and the session is being recorded for viewing after today. I would ask that you put your questions for the panellists in the Q&A section. These will be asked by Sirin in the second half, and I'm really sorry that we won't have time for all the questions. At 11 o'clock, we'll be joined by Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. And feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself. We'd love to know who we have with us today, but obviously it goes without saying that we'd ask everyone to be considerate in the chat. And finally, we're delighted that we're joined today by a live illustrator, Katie Chappell, who will be creating an artistic impression of the session, which we can see later. So I'll now hand over to Sirin.
Thank you so much for having me today, Rebecca. It's such important work that Rosa and all of its partner organisations that it supports is doing. And I'm really, really happy to be here. Violence against women and girls is an issue that's very, very dear to my heart. So yeah, without further ado, let's get to it. So we have some wonderful panellists today. We have Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs from Surviving Economic Abuse. We have Harriet Wistrich from the Centre for Women's Justice. We have Deeba Syed from Rights of Women, and we have Umme Imam from the Angelou Centre. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to ask each panellist to give a sort of around 5 minute overview of their year, the challenges, the highlights, the struggles around the theme of resilience, which is obviously the theme of today's discussion, along with innovation. And then afterwards, we'll be taking questions from the audience. I know that this was already mentioned by Rebecca, but please do just put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, because they can get lost in the chat box. So perhaps Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, you might be able to start and give us a brief rundown of the last year and what struggles you found and how you've overcome them through resilience and innovation.
Hi, thanks Sirin, and good morning everyone. Thanks to Rosa for inviting us to be part of this fantastic panel, sitting alongside wonderful women who will tell you about all the fantastic work that they're doing. So in terms of kicking off, we were asked to think about the themes of resilience and innovation, the power of the sector more broadly, and also some of the challenges which are ongoing. So that's how I'm going to sort of structure my 5 minutes. I was quite shocked actually that it's exactly 15 months to the day since we sort of entered into this period. It feels like forever, and at the same time yesterday. But certainly I think, you know, as a sector, we watched what was happening worldwide, and it was really clear from other experiences in other countries and through the nature of the actions that would need to be taken to protect society from the virus, that would inadvertently harm victims of domestic abuse and women and girls experiencing violence more broadly. And alongside other organisations within the violence and women and girls sector, you know, really did speak out very quickly to warn the Westminster government, you know, that shielding, social distancing would increase the isolation of victims and survivors, and also reinforce and expand the power and control of perpetrators. And I think we were all disappointed in terms of the time that it really took government to sort of listen and to take heed of those messages, and to perhaps to have done some work ahead of putting those measures in place. But that did eventually come. At Surviving Economic Abuse, we were also particularly concerned about the economic instability arising from the impact of the protective measures taken. We recognised that they would help create a conducive context to start, continue or escalate economic abuse as a form of coercive and controlling behaviour. And we also recognised the economic pressures that would act both as a barrier to leaving an abusive partner and a pressure to return. And, you know, we really did see that impact overnight. So our website saw an increase in 84% of traffic when the first lockdown was announced. And 3 weeks later, when that second period of lockdown was announced, that rose to 257% increase in website traffic overnight. So, you know, really our worst fears were being realised. And at the same time, the National Financial Support Service for Victims of Domestic Abuse, which we run in partnership with Money Advice Plus, saw a 65% increase in calls overall. And I think it's really important to flag that high demand shows no sign of abating. It's just remained consistent since then. So I think, like others, you know, we really clung to our values as an organisation and really focused on our mission and how we were going to repivot to be able to support victims and survivors at this time, and to be doing that in a different way. One of our values is being agile, and I don't think we've ever been so agile as we were in those early days, and how we've continued really to operate. So one of the first things we did was develop a set of online resources in support of victims and survivors' immediate economic safety needs. So this included really sort of detailed information about the financial support measures that government and financial institutions were putting into place. And it was really important as well to provide a guide on how friends, family members, colleagues, employers, and also neighbours could recognise economic abuse and coercive and controlling behaviour more broadly, and provide support. And very much did that along with organisations within the women and girls sector. So making sure that, you know, we weren't replicating anything that other people were doing, and that everything, you know, was really complementary and could be shared. Because, you know, as you can imagine, we were also all, you know, reorganising ourselves and the ways of working at the time, and, you know, and coping with the impact that this was having on individuals, as well as the victims and survivors we were in contact with. So we also undertook influencing work to meet those immediate economic safety needs that we could see. And did a number of things in that space. I just looked at the time, so I'm not going to go into that detail, but I am going to talk about a bit of research which has been published and which outlines those things. It was just really clear that the pandemic would demand new solutions, and we undertook a rapid review, speaking to over 350 victims and survivors to see how they could be supported at this time. And I think, again, what was really clear is what victims and survivors were saying was that the abusers had used COVID-19 to their advantage. So I think, you know, what was happening here was that people were using COVID-19 to their advantage in terms of exerting power and control, and that was compounding existing economic inequalities. Because, again, as we know, COVID-19 measures had a disproportionate impact on women generally. And as a consequence of the research that we undertook with funding from the Standard Life Foundation, we captured the findings across a number of themes. So education, employment, finances, which included welfare benefits and child maintenance, access to daily necessities such as food and utilities, housing and help seeking, and we made recommendations in each of those areas. What I would flag was that a number of victims and survivors who responded to our survey as part of that work were no longer living with the perpetrator, and I think that really served to illustrate just how prevalent economic abuse as a form of coercive and controlling behaviour is post-separation. And it reinforced the work that we were doing during the same period in relation to the domestic abuse bill. So at that time, we're calling for an amendment to the bill, which would broaden the scope of the coercive controlling behaviour offence within the Serious Crime Act to ensure that economic abuse and other forms of post-separation abuse could be criminalised, and it would apply for those no longer living with an abuser or having ended a relationship with them. And I think it was really, again, the collective power of the sector that meant that we all kept pushing for improvements to the domestic abuse bill in this way. And I know that my fellow panel members will share what they did. But, you know, I think it was really testament actually to the team and to the sector generally. We were so stretched, both in terms of meeting the immediate needs of victims and survivors, ensuring the well-being of our own teams, the impact of COVID, the life events that we were continuing to experience through COVID, but which just seemed so much worse through that lens, and also the world events that Rebecca referred to during her introduction. You know, it was a really full-on time and so much was going on. And it just felt fantastic as the sector's kind of really come together and still been able to achieve change during what have been the most difficult times. You know, the weekly meetings of the Violence Against Women and Girls sector and the weekly call from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, which also included government departments and enabled us to have a kind of a direct line for sharing concerns. And a lot of those surviving economic abuse that victims and survivors were sharing were around child maintenance in particular, and how that source of income had been completely stopped by some abusers, again, using the situation to claim they could no longer afford to make those payments. And I think linked to this, our connections across sectors also really came into their own. So with child maintenance work with Gingerbread and Step Change, but also the banks and building societies that we were already working with started to share how customer disclosures of domestic abuse were increasing. And that was because it was more difficult for victims and survivors to reach out to specialist domestic abuse services. So I think the pandemic illustrated, you know, that people like, you know, banks and building societies, customer vulnerability teams can offer an alternative pathway to support. And similarly, employers were getting into contact to see what they could do about the economic safety of their employees. So things like emergency accommodation and financial grants. So I'd also say that despite all the obstacles that the pandemic brought, it's been a time where we've actually seen extraordinary innovation in responses to economic abuse. So in terms of the challenges, and I'll be really brief, I think the first is the pent-up demand that we know is coming. We were able to use emergency funding to expand the team, but how do we keep that funding up? How do we increase that capacity, keep more funds coming in when our fundraising activity like that across the sector has been disrupted? And we know that cases are going to be more complex. They're already taking longer to untangle. The emotional support needs are higher, both for the victims and survivors and also the team who are supporting them. So how do we deal with all of that? You know, the Act was fantastic, but at the same time, it was not landmark in that it didn't afford the same rights to migrant women, which is a real shortfall of the bill. And again, I'm sure Angelou Centre will talk more to that. But despite recognition of economic abuse in the statutory definition, including criminalisation of post-separation abuse, government policy is not consistent. So we still have no recourse to public funds, policies such as universal credit, legal aid, which don't reflect an understanding of economic abuse. I think, you know, another challenge is the decoupling of the domestic abuse strategy from the new Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, not really reflecting the reality of women's lives and experiences. So I'll just conclude by saying that really we do need a response that addresses structural issues, including women's economic equality going forward if we are going to create safety. So really understanding those links between economic safety and women's physical space, women's physical safety in all contexts. As I said in conclusion, you know, a lot of positives, but still a huge amount to do. And I'd just like to end with the words of one victim and survivor who we spoke to. And she said that the response to women and girls should be the same, whether it's a national emergency or a personal crisis.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for that. And it sounds like you've been doing incredible work all year in really difficult circumstances. I'd love to introduce Harriet Wistrich now from the Centre for Women's Justice to talk about their work over the last year and the challenges they faced and examples of resilience and innovation in response to those.
Thanks very much, Sirin. And yes, Nicola's done a pretty major gallop through a lot of the issues around the joint working, which I'll touch on. Just in case people don't know, Centre for Women's Justice is quite a new-ish charity established about 5 years ago, which is a legal charity. We aim to hold the state accountable around violence against women and girls and challenge discrimination in the criminal justice system. So our focus is particularly on criminal justice work. And the work that we do, we're a kind of second tier organisation, so we do a lot of work with the frontline organisations. We do a lot of training for ISVAs and IDFAs around the ways in which you can advocate effectively to identify legal issues and ways in which you can challenge people like the police, Crown Prosecution Service and other criminal justice agencies using the law, using the policies that exist. Where those, and I think we've helped a lot of organisations and kind of empowered them really to be more effective advocates in some ways, and where there are issues around that aren't resolvable through day-to-day advocacy. What we're doing is putting them in touch with lawyers. So we've got a lawyers reference panel to take cases forward. And then we're also, through the work we're doing across England and Wales, gathering and identifying systemic issues that arise, which can lead to strategic litigation challenges and super complaints and other forms of impact litigation and legal work. And so I was going to mention a couple of areas that we've been very busy with in recent years. One is around the prosecution of rape, which has been at an all-time low, as many people know. It's fallen to the lowest level in terms of the volumes of prosecution. So although there's been more women reporting rape over the last 10 years, the decisions to prosecute are collapsing. And we represented the End Violence Against Women Coalition in a big legal challenge of the Director of Public Prosecutions, seeking to highlight how we felt they were responsible to a change in approach. And that challenge gathered a great deal of publicity and media coverage, and a crowd justice fund which attracted funding from hundreds, thousands of survivors and family and friends and others who were really concerned about what was going on with rape, who donated to support the legal challenge, which ultimately, unfortunately, failed in March of this year. The Court of Appeal rejected our challenge. However, we felt that we actually won in the court of public opinion, and that through the pressure of that legal challenge, we really influenced the government's end-to-end rape review, which was actually published at the end of last week. And although there are huge shortcomings in that rape review, there are important developments, and we know that the government are on the back foot. We know that the Crown Prosecution Service have been, and the police have had to really double down and kind of redouble their efforts to improve things. So, I think it's important to remember that even when you bring a legal challenge and ultimately the challenge fails in the courts, and that fails because of legal technicalities often, it doesn't actually mean it wasn't worth bringing. So that was a really important challenge. And the other one, if I've got time just to mention, which kind of also gathered a huge amount of publicity, was a super complaint that we brought in relation to police perpetrated abuse. So what we discovered was that many women are, and this was really highlighted as well at the time of the Sarah Everard case, that many women are subject to abuse and violence from police officers, unfortunately. And there is a real lack of accountability within the police for police perpetrated abuse. And once we put together this super complaint, which initially involved about 20 cases, suddenly, once it was publicised, we were flooded with women coming forward saying, this happened to me, I was too frightened to report, or he told me no one would believe me, or I reported and this case wasn't investigated properly, and there has to be a way in which I can trust the police to investigate allegations I made against their own serving police officers. So we have made a series of recommendations for improvement. We're waiting for the inspectorate who are looking at that super complaint to report back. So those are just a couple of things that we've been very involved with, just on the women's sector generally. I think that seeing everyone coming together and working around, we'd already kind of been organised around the domestic abuse bill. And we were also involved in a couple of amendments that we tried to bring in, one successful around non-fatal strangulation, one unsuccessful so far around defences for women who are unjustly criminalised as a result of domestic abuse. But the coalition working in the face of the huge challenges we faced over the last 15 months has been very inspiring, and that also then moved into after the Black Lives Matter moment, into a lot of work around anti-racism as well. So I think despite the terrible times that all of us have faced, there has been some amazing work around coalition working and around kind of taking the women's sector forward as a powerful and connected movement. So I think it's heartening to see that joint working happening, and I'll leave there.
Thank you very much, Harriet. And just from my perspective as a journalist, I think absolutely there has been a sea change in the last year in public opinion around rape convictions. And that's down to the work you're doing, and it's been amazing to see. I'd love to introduce now Deeba Syed of the Rights of Women to talk about resilience, innovation, and the challenges of the last year.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with all these amazing women, and thank you for the opportunity to reflect on how the hell this year has gone, because when I stop and think about it, it's actually sort of extraordinary. And I just want to talk a bit about the practical challenges we've had at Rights of Women. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to our offices, but it's very analog. You know, we run different advice line services, and it's literally a phone in the wall. So when the lockdown happened and our offices were shut, we were devastated, because obviously we're delivering frontline services. The service I run for women who are sexually harassed in the workplace was relatively new, only a year so old. And we couldn't come to the offices, and the volunteers that we rely on to deliver our service couldn't come. So we had an extraordinary challenge of how we were going to carry on our services and get to the women who we knew needed us. And it's been very difficult. So at first, I mean, I didn't want to shut down the line at all. So I was just doing all the shifts by myself at first. Because I felt like we had to keep delivering the service, we couldn't reduce it. But that was quite a burden on me. And I think there was a lot of burnout in terms of the organisation just trying to deliver the services, and all working from home from the first time and doing Zoom meetings. And it all seems very normal now, but of course it was extraordinary at the time. One of the sort of main things we had to kind of do was a technological update. So we had to move all of our services, our phone services online, which was very, very difficult to do. And we had to really think about the way we deliver our service, because a lot of the women who give our advice, you know, they just told us that we can't do it because we're homeschooling, and we can't volunteer for you the same way that we used to. But having said that, now that we've moved to remote services, it has really completely expanded what we've been able to do. We can offer more hours. We can get anybody in the country can now volunteer, and we actually have increased hours than we did before, which is, you know, really good thing. So thank God for technology, right? In terms of the women who were actually calling us, so I'll speak from my service as well. I think I was a bit worried when the pandemic happened, you know, all the good work that's, you know, since Me Too and getting sexual harassment in the workplace on the political agenda. I was just terrified that this was all going to be back to zero, because it was just not going to be seen as a priority anymore. And that is true in terms of all the policy work that was happening. The government just completely halted that and just said, we don't have time because of COVID and the pandemic. But of course, what was extremely obvious to me in terms of taking the calls is that all of these things were completely interrelated, because the calls we got as soon as the pandemic happened was women who were calling us from the front line. Most of our callers are working in the NHS or in the care sector. You know, these are predominantly women-focused services. You know, 70% of women in the NHS are women, 80% in social care, and they weren't getting access to PPE, sick pay, furlough complications, you know, these were the things that they needed support and help on. And also the harassment and discrimination, it only it only increased because the pressure on the front line was extraordinary, and therefore the abuse of the people who were working on the front line just increased. And then we saw everything, the sort of way that everything was being dealt with in a sort of gendered way. So in terms of redundancies, people being laid off, people being fired, businesses being closed, this was, it was obvious to us that this was impacting women, much more so than was being registered, I think. And then in terms of the actual abuse women were experiencing, of course, we always, focus on the abuse that happens in a domestic setting, but women are interacting with men in the workplace, several hours a day. They have the levels of abuse in the workplace are extraordinary. So if you're being harassed by somebody, I'm afraid the pandemic made no difference. What we saw was a spike of women telling us that the harassment situation they were in was turning into a stalking situation, their perpetrator was turning up at their house, finding their personal details, because just because a pandemic happens doesn't mean a perpetrator stops. So we were seeing those kinds of things as well. And then we were seeing exactly what you said, Nicola, about perpetrators using the pandemic to perpetrate abuse. So what we saw was in the workplace situation, for example, I was speaking to a woman who told us that the employer had furloughed everybody else in the office apart from her, the person that he was harassing, so that she would be alone in the office with him. And it just increased the kind of the level of control and abuse that he had over her. And then we just couldn't believe how many people were being still forced to work. There were just entire work operations that were carrying on, ignoring all the COVID advice and the lockdown advice. We were seeing, extraordinary employment abuses happening. And I think a lot of that wasn't getting to the media attention. I was getting a lot of requests about talking about working from home and like harassment on Zoom and Microsoft Teams and things like that. And I was like, yes, of course, that's part of it. But what we're seeing actually is women on the front line who are being put in extraordinarily pressured and difficult situations. So we wanted to do a bit of work to kind of challenge this idea that everybody was working from home now, so sexual harassment wasn't happening in the workplace. So we did a survey to kind of challenge that notion and say, look, if people are, online harassment isn't new. If somebody wanted to harass you, they could have been doing that on social media. Yes, they can do it on Zoom now, but it's all still there and it's all still happening. So we kind of wanted to challenge that. And then I just want to say as well, I mean, I think when we look at the sort of extraordinary cultural movements that have happened as well, post-COVID, I mean, Black Lives Matters, the revival in the summer of the movement, and I think the reaction to Sarah Everard's death, and I look at now the Everyone's Invited movement, which is kind of, I don't think any of those movements would have been possible had there not been a pandemic, because I think the whole pandemic has just shown how deep and structural inequality is in our society. And people, I don't know if they've just been glued to their phones or social media has helped on this, but I think those have been extraordinary movements that have only been possible because for the first time, not for the first time, but in this extraordinary moment, these things have been highlighted. And I think people do want to come back out of COVID to a different world, which is more fair, more equal, and less kind of people being oppressed by situations that they can't help. And then just finally, just some of the good things that have come out of the work of all of this year is I've seen a lot of employers want advice on how to handle domestic abuse in the workplace. They want to do the right things. And also we've come to discover that there is a real gap in the law in terms of coercive control not applying to the workplace. And now, because of all the work that's happened, all the sort of information that we've got from the pandemic, I think we are in a position to better be able to advocate for that and have the evidence base to show that. So we'll see what happens next, but those are the kinds of innovations and types of resilience we've been doing at Rights Women.
Thank you so much, Deeba. And just before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to remind everybody to please leave some questions in the Q&A box. So far we have no questions, which is fine for me because I have loads of questions, but I think it'll probably be better if the attendees were asking questions themselves. So yeah, please do start thinking about some questions. And before we get to the Q&A, I'd love to ask Umme Imam from the Angelou Centre to please talk about her highlights of the last year, what challenges she's faced and how she's shown resilience in overcoming them along with her team.
Good morning all. It's great to be part of this panel here, and I suppose I'm the organization now speaking on behalf of all my other partners in other organizations that are at the very front line and at the coalface of providing help and support to women across the board. The Angelou Centre is a Black-led women's organization. We've been around for nearly 30 years. We provide, I'm just trying to get this presentation on. All right. So that, never mind. So our work is very much based in promoting equality and human rights, addressing the inequality that the intersections of race and gender with other forms of oppression bring about in women's lives. We've been around for nearly 30 years now, and one of our key strategic objectives is to promote voice and choice for Black and minoritized women, and we provide extensive services which have developed in response to the needs and the demands of the women we work with. They are central to our work. Everything that we do is very much rooted in what the women that we work with require and need. So there are three key areas that we work around. So we started off as an organization promoting economic inclusion and economic independence for Black and minoritized women right in the 1990s, early 1990s. But very quickly, a holistic support for women, which meant addressing all the barriers that there were to their economic inclusion, meant that violence against women and girls was an issue that we were sort of faced with and had to really look at addressing initially through referring women on to projects, specialists. There was a specialist refuge in the area, and then that's what we were referring women on to. But then as that was decommissioned, it was very much delivering those services ourselves. We've been doing that for a decade now, looking at outreach and support, as well as refuge and accommodation. COVID-19, as my colleagues earlier have mentioned, did reveal the stark inequalities and the racialized ways in which public policy continues to ignore and not meet the needs of Black and minoritized women and communities. So what was it that happened to us, and where did we find ourselves as we went into the pandemic? And it was very much immediately a big jump in terms of referrals. And interestingly, initially, a lot of our referrals would be self-referrals, but now 60 to 65% of increase in referrals, predominantly from mainstream agencies not able to deal with the needs and demands of the women, specifically those with no recourse to public funds. Now, we've got a refuge accommodation for women with no recourse. That's specific. At any given point over the last year, we've had 6 to 8 bed spaces that have all gone now, because very much until March, they were funded by the Tampon Tax Fund, and then that's funding's ended. So that's one of the things that we've seen. But we also saw a 6-fold increase in our referrals for refuge accommodation, and again, predominantly for women with no recourse to funds, but also women perceived to have no recourse to public funds. So these women on spousal visas who would have, but agencies not quite picking that up and addressing it. And obviously that this, increase led to us really reviewing that holistic support was further needed, and there need to be more well-being and training, inclusion, recovery services that had to be put in place to meet that demand. We also found out that women who were being referred in were at a higher threshold of risk, and therefore required a lot more support than they would have otherwise needed if they'd been at low points. Obviously, I said earlier, continued socioeconomic inequalities, and demonstrating that the needs of Black and minoritized women and children were not being met. And again, for many of the women that we work with, this was re-traumatization. Women were, felt that they were being controlled again in terms of their movement just because of the pandemic. And then the sheer fear and anxiety that dominated, particularly as it was revealed that this had a disproportionate impact on Black and minoritized people. So what did we do? Was it innovative, or was it what we've always done, responded to the needs of the women that we're working with? So at whatever speed, it was a really steep learning curve, and we just had to jump in and start. So initially it was about, obviously, safety and survival. So survivors and women who are already within our refuges, but also within our advocacy and outreach services, responding to their needs very quickly. Moving online, moving support online, getting colleagues very quickly skilled up to start delivering these services online. Another inequality, which was always prevalent, never been highlighted as much, is the digital inequality faced by Black and minoritized communities in specifically, but more particularly in terms of women. So we had to set up a tech bank. Again, look for resources, fundraise, and then set up a technology bank, which was around looking for things like tablets, phones, just so that we could engage women in the delivery for services. We deliver counseling and support for women and children. All this, again, moved either online or through telephone contact. And then also, one of the big things that we were really faced with the huge demand in terms of just basic food and hygiene projects, because in the very early years of the pandemic, all the food banks had closed down. There was nowhere for women who were primarily reliant on these food banks for their everyday, subsistence, who just weren't able to access that. So it was moving very quickly into that. So we were colleagues, I've got an amazing team, and we were very swiftly delivering food parcels to 50 women, 25 women in refuges and 25 women outside, and sometimes it would extend to a few more, and that would be food and hygiene projects as well. Staff support, that was a big issue, because as mentioned earlier, women were working from home, had families to support, had bereavement, had all sorts of issues going on in their lives. And again, as Black and minoritized women, were facing these disproportionately compared to other colleagues. So we set up staff well-being lounges, yoga, meditation, in addition to what we were already doing with the women, because what we quickly learned was that, yes, we could deliver the training and development remotely, and we could focus on women who were in the refuge and our work services. But what we also needed to make sure was that the staff were well supported and were able to work through some of those issues as well. And again, we were voice and choice for us. Our key aim is to promote voice and choice for the women we work with. So it was engaging with partnerships, networks to take part in the campaigning, to take part in those weekly sector meetings that were called, working with IMCFAN, working with Women's Aid, just making sure that the voices of Black and minoritized women, and especially those from the North, because we often get missed out, are at the center of looking at it. And also not just in those spaces as well, but also looking at institutional and advocacy at an agency level, and making sure that agencies like children's social care, like health, and like the others, were meeting the needs of the women that we were working with. And above all, centering all this in Women's Voices. We had a Women's Voices group, which met monthly, started meeting fortnightly, so that really could shape what was required and what we needed to do to support the women that we were working with. And so that's how we've continued. I think we will continue with some of this, as some of my colleagues have said earlier. There are some positives. So, the remote counseling and therapeutic support means that we can reach a wider group of women. Women find that more comfortable rather than traveling on public transport with children sometimes to come and attend the sessions. They can do that remotely now. A lot of our training, again, can be delivered remotely and women can access that. So yes, some positives, but what is a big negative is, despite the campaigning, despite the work that's happened in partnership, looking at, yes, so we have come up with a charter in terms of looking at promoting anti-racism within the women's sector, especially the refuge sector. But as far as no recourse to public funds is concerned, despite that campaigning that was spoken about earlier, migrant women have been excluded from the Domestic Abuse Act now, no longer will, and therefore continue to face that discrimination, disadvantage, and very often just life and death in relation to them and themselves, because there isn't the appropriate services or support to help them.
Thank you so much, Umme, for that. Yeah, just sounds like an incredibly difficult year, but one that everybody here has overcome with remarkable ingenuity and creativity. And we have a few questions. The first question is from Anna Wiley. She says, really interesting and inspiring talk from the panelists. Thank you. Lots of the panel mentioned the funding landscape is more difficult, fewer funds are available and more organisations are competing with them. Has anyone found or heard about innovative ways of fundraising or diversifying income? Would anybody like to take that? I think, Harriet, you've been experimenting with crowdfunding, haven't you?
Crowdfunding is something that's turned out to be quite useful in some of the legal challenges we brought. It's a bit variable. It sort of relies on members of the public to donate, but certainly where you have a really big issue that affects and impacts very widely, like rape in the criminal justice system, and people can see a kind of concrete aim, that can be a useful source of income. I mean, in fact, it just really was covering the risk that we might lose, which, so unfortunately most of the money raised has gone to the bloody Crown Prosecution Service because we lost the case, which is very infuriating, but it enabled us to bring the case. But yeah, I mean, other than that, we've sought to diversify as much as possible, not just rely on grant funding. We don't go to government ourselves because we're challenging the state all the time. And just kind of all sorts of different sort of initiatives that we can think of to increase. So we've been reasonably lucky ourselves in terms of fundraising, but I know it's a very tough landscape.
Thanks, Harriet. And we have a question from Kerry Abel. Kerry's from Abortion Rights. We campaign to keep abortion legal and accessible. Currently, women can access their early medical abortion pills online, but it's just for the pandemic at the moment. We've heard from community providers who are going above and beyond to provide care to women in intimate partner violence situations. I wanted to ask, firstly, how abortion and partner abuse overlap and how can you deal with it in your organisations? And secondly, how can we best make the case to the government to keep telemedicine and home use after the pandemic? Does anyone like to take that? I feel like, Deeba, this might be a bit in your wheelhouse.
This is such an important issue. Yeah, I remember when the pandemic first started and there was this whole conversation about getting basic access to this kind of healthcare. I don't have much to say on this, but what I would encourage you to do is to write to Rights of Women and educate us more about this. It's not my particular area, but I'm sure it's something that employers should be thinking about. It's something that our family lawyers will undoubtedly be thinking about. So why don't you drop us an email and we can stay in conversation about how to make sure that women are getting this, because I absolutely agree. I'm sure it's been falling off people's radar, and yeah, we need to get it up the agenda and make sure that things are improved after the pandemic is over, whenever that is.
Also, just from a personal perspective, Carrie, I think that sounds like a really important story and one I could definitely help you with if you wanted to run it somewhere. Okay, we have a question from Joe Francis, and this is for Umme in particular. We have found that access to data and its inaffordability has become a real barrier to accessing support online. So I think Joe means like internet data and mobile credit and things like that. Have you found this too, and have you developed any ways to overcome this?
Not really. I think we have basically worked at using sort of simple platforms like Zoom. I mean, you need to look at the women that you're working with to see, what we're delivering and at what level we would need that. So that's already done something that we've used in terms of evaluating and getting that feedback from women, and that engaging very well with is Mentimeter, which has helped. But otherwise, I think Zoom, WhatsApp, as I've been in FaceTime, have been primarily the ways in which we've used media to engage with the women that we're working with.
Okay, we don't have any more questions from the audience just yet, but please do send them. But I have a question, which is just from listening to all the work that everyone's been doing, it sounds like you've all been working 24/7 around the clock. Deeba, I think you were personally answering most of the phone calls yourself. How do you address burnout in terms of both from an individual perspective and then also secondly in terms of your staff and volunteers? Nicola, do you have any insights on that you might like to share, or anyone else who has an opportunity to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's a really important question because part of what we've been talking about is that increase in demand, but also the fact that we've been working from home and that kind of blurring between boundaries of work and home. So I suppose personally, things which kind of touch on slightly the question about the fundraising piece, that we did both personally and across the team was sort of encourage people to get out and about walking. So we created a See Steps campaign where we walked to visit all our partners across the world who are going through a similar experience. And we had some great pro bono support from an organisation called Mantle. We sort of created a way that we could download our steps and track our progress together. That really got me out the house, and I know team members really appreciated it as well. And then it was a great way to engage our partners across the sector. So people like the CBI and Aviva joined us in their teams. So again, sort of carrying the message, at the same time raising funds, and I think really sort of helping in support of burnout. We were diarising, our walks and our diaries and saying actually your well-being is really important during this time. And what I would also say is we had something called Wednesday Wellbeing Days, where we actually, unless it was absolutely vital to be working on a Wednesday afternoon, the team just didn't work on a Wednesday afternoon. We just had a midweek break. And I just think, again, that really helped us. And it's something we've sort of carried on through Wellbeing Days going forward as well. So I think one of the biggest takeaways, it's always difficult to look after yourself, I think, in this work. But again, another positive is being forced to, I think, through the pandemic. And I think it's another piece that's kind of led to improvements perhaps in terms of the way we work moving forward.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank everybody so much. I think that this conversation was absolutely fascinating and I'm in awe of the work that everyone's doing. We're going to take a 5-minute comfort break now, well, a 4-minute comfort break actually. And then when we come back at 11 a.m, we're going to have Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, and she's going to be giving a brief talk and then answering a few questions. So if we could all just cameras off, microphones muted, and then we'll just pop back in a few minutes at 11 to welcome Nicole. Welcome back, everybody. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. It's been a really important year. It's been a really, sorry about that. It's been a really important year in the UK in terms of domestic abuse. Obviously, we've had the landmark domestic abuse bill. Nicole will be talking for about 10 minutes about her work over the course of this year. And then we will have a few minutes, around 8 minutes of questioning before we wrap up at 11:20. So thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Thank you. It's great to be here. And I'm a huge fan of Rosa, the Rosa Fund, and always have been. And in previous roles have been the beneficiary of some funding to do work with work in relation to FGM and some of the work that you often see needing to be really supported and growing in smaller organizations and services. And so I've always really been a huge admirer of all of the recipients of your funds and the way that Rosa Fund has been set up and runs itself, and the very specific focus on women and girls and violence against women and girls. And so I'm really pleased to be here. Wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces here, and I can see many more participants. For those of you who've probably heard me do this a few times, I'll apologize, but for the rest of the people at the conference, I'd love to just introduce myself and talk a little bit about the office. And I know you're really reflecting today on kind of what's happened and what progress has been made over the last year in particular. And so one of the things I would like to do is just explain a little bit about how the office was created, what we're doing, what matters, what might be different into the future in terms of how we would really hope to play a role at the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office. So many of you will know I was appointed a little bit more than a year ago as a designate domestic abuse commissioner, and many people, and I don't necessarily disagree with this, would have said, why wouldn't we have kind of a broader commissioner in relation to violence against women and girls? And I certainly recognize and fully acknowledge the kind of overlap between and interconnectedness between domestic abuse and wider issues of sexual violence, stalking, harassment, so-called honor-based violence, forced marriage, all of the range of things we tend to talk about in relation to violence against women and girls. And I do try to work as much as I possibly can with Vera Baird, who's our victims commissioner, and really trying to cover between us that entire remit of work. But I was appointed knowing that in the domestic abuse bill, which is now an act as of the end of April, that there would be the Office of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, so a statutory role for this range of issues that would be given certain powers that we now have. So one is the ability to cooperate, or the duty to cooperate for public bodies in seeking information, which I'll come back to, and also an ability to make recommendations to public bodies that have to be responded to within 56 days. And those are important powers that my office has, and they certainly will help me and my team do some of the things that I'll describe that we're up to now. But we're appointed, or I was appointed by government, but to be independent of government. So because my office is given public funds, a lot of the hiring and the kind of connected responsibilities about how I do that is very connected to the civil service. But in terms of policy and voice and my own view about independence and how we act as an office, it is very independent of government and has been since day one. In fact, during the whole of the domestic abuse bill debates, I very actively supported amendments to the act that were contrary to what the government was sometimes supporting. So some of the time we agree, and some of the time we may disagree, and that's part and parcel of being in the role of a commissioner and having a comfort level to both advise but also hold government to account and disagree when necessary. So just to give you some context to the role, that's some of how we were created and where we come from, and maybe why you may not have heard of my office yet, because it's relatively new, and only recently the Domestic Abuse Act passed. And in fact, the implementation of that act is very, very staggered, and there's a lot of elements to it. So the parts that relate to my office are being prioritized, but some of the regulation and the implementation of those powers will come in early autumn. And there's many, many parts to our Domestic Abuse Act, which I'm sure you've talked about today and will talk about, which we're really seeking much more clarity in terms of when the various parts of the act will be implemented and enacted. To give you an example, my office has a spreadsheet of about 90 some items on it, which are obligations stemming from the Domestic Abuse Act. And we're really trying to fill in as many of the gaps that we have about when things will be implemented, at what time, what various government departments are needing to do in terms of procedural rules or regulations to get those bits enacted. So that to one side, many of the kinds of the kinds of activities of my office are very centered on and priorities in relation to kind of a coordinated community response to domestic abuse. And in the center of that has got to be a greater recognition of the variation from place to place in terms of our core services for domestic abuse. So we're doing some mapping right now in England and in Wales in terms of being able to establish exactly the pathways and the service system that we have in place, which is of course very, very complex because of the way it's been built up over time, the fact that our services are not core funded in such a way that what we map today will be different than what may be in place in 2 months' time or in 6 months' time. And also a recognition that we have many, many gaps in terms of services for children, for adult survivors or victims of abuse, and for perpetrators to change. So we have a lot of mapping to do, a lot of variation within that mapping, and really trying to unpick how services are incredibly dynamic in terms of getting funding from various sources, and how that patches together to have the services that we need is really important to map for many reasons. One, I would hope would be of great use to organizations like Rosa, to other trusts and foundations who fund a lot, as you know, in this space, but also to very importantly make the argument to government that we need to extend the duty for services to community-based services, so that we can, as a sector, have much more core fundamental a foundation to funding, which is much more assured and is planned and mapped into the longer term. And so these are the kind of core reasons we're doing some of that mapping. And in addition, we have quite a bit of work going on in terms of trying to look at very particular needs. So right now we're doing some mapping we'll have at the end of the month in relation to support for court, and that's family court and criminal court, that we really want to use again to kind of present some of the urgent needs in terms of backlogs and the needs for people in government to recognize more funding is needed, whether that's through spending review, victims funding strategy, a lot of opportunities ahead of us that we can really work together to really make some of these core asks. Last point, because I want to leave some room for questions, but we're also really trying to work across government in terms of our policy team at the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office to make sure that we're impacting that kind of wider coordinated community response. So what's the policy work that we would like to be seeing in all government departments, a thread of consistency and governance within at a ministerial level, much more importance that we want to see within each and every department, and also filtering down. So that gives you a little bit of a taster of, I hope, some of the progress that's been made in the year in relation to our office, but also some of the work ahead that we're currently doing and working on, so that you understand what you can expect from me. And I suppose I would just say, as a last comment, a very open invitation to be in touch with our office. If you haven't been already, I expect anyone on this call would be the core of the people that we would need to be talking to, understanding in terms of the problems and challenges that you're seeing, and also, really importantly, the good practice that you are creating and really growing, and that we need to see more of. So always feel that you can be directly in touch, and how much we would want to hear from you at the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, me personally and the whole team that we have. So thank you again for having me, and really happy to address any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Nicole. While we wait for a few more questions to come in, I had a quick question for you myself, if that's okay.
Sure.
About how you have a dual role, which is obviously holding the government to account, but also advising them and working with them. I was wondering how you're going to continue advocating for women with no recourse to public funds, as obviously they were left out of the landmark domestic abuse bill.
That's right. It's a huge priority because of that. I mean, it always was, and throughout the bill process, obviously, I've been really, really trying to keep that at one of the consistent messages I always would give about the bill. What we're trying to do now is more focus on, particularly in the last few weeks, the firewall. So, the government is needing to address the HMIC and the super complaint that stemmed that created that HMIC report just before Christmas, about what is the detail of what would be needed in terms of a firewall between the police and other services and immigration services. So in some ways, we're working in kind of very, very detailed ways to try to get in the middle of those discussions alongside experts from the sector, obviously, who really need to really weigh in to those detailed discussions. And then more broadly, it is one of the policy themes that remains a priority. So whether that's in, discussions about the VOG strategy, or the domestic abuse strategy, which should come shortly after that, the statutory guidance, but in every single stream of our policy work. So yesterday with DWP, it will come into discussions in terms of the Department of Health, MHCLG. It is one of those issues that we are highly committed to, in terms of really making sure that it remains a very high priority and that government appreciates that. A couple of other things that we're doing is we've commissioned some work through the Angelou Centre and also some academic work that specifically get to some more information that we need to help with our policy work in this area. So very practical things that could be fixed and addressed non-legislatively, that would improve the safety for migrant survivors, and also more of a mapping of how we can get to more accurate numbers, so that, again, we can influence policy work. So it's not easy in the context, but we are trying to be as proactive as we can be in those areas.
Thanks, Nicole. And we have a question from Maureen Story. Does Nicole consider that local authorities can use some of their MHCLG funding allocation to support community-based services for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, e.g. mental health recovery services?
I think it would depend on what MHCLG funding it is. I think it could be about Part 4, the accommodation-based services that have now become a statutory duty as part of the Act. And so I do think there are a lot of teething problems in terms of how tier 1 boards, the county level boards, are mapping and assessing their needs, and at very quick pace trying to put in to place the duty. And our understanding of that is that some areas are doing that very, very well, and some of them haven't necessarily prepared in the same way as colleagues in different places about the duty coming online. MHCLG has given local authorities already funding, £125 million of funding to cover this duty, because that is part and parcel of what happens when something becomes a statutory duty. But I think there are controversies about how that can be used for what. A lot of controversy about it needing to be sitting within specialist services, which is what I would say. There's some, I think, some local areas, because they're making decisions at such quick pace, may not be taking all of the advice that they potentially need to be taking. And we've been trying to, encourage MHCLG to be as clear and coherent about clarification for that. And they've got the guidance for Part 4 out for consultation right now. So that would be something that I would encourage everyone to look for. So there's been this slightly kind of out of sequence process, which has caused a lot of confusion, in summary, in that you've got a duty that's coming into place slightly before it's legally required, and money coming to local areas in anticipation of that duty. And it is difficult. There's no doubt about the difficulty about that. But in terms of specifics, I'd be really happy if she would get in touch and we could talk a little bit more specifically, and I'd be happy to signpost to some of the right people at MHCLG who can clarify some of those problems at the local level. They've been really clear that they're happy to hear about issues and clarify issues in relation to Part 4 at the local level in individual cases like that. So I would be really happy to hear directly and maybe get in touch. I'll put my contact details in the chat.
Brilliant. I think we have time for one very quick question, as long as you keep your answer to less than a minute, Nicole.
That's very hard, as you can tell. Sorry, I'll try.
That's okay. So this is from Fozia, and she's asking for an update on the appointment for the geographic lead for the Northeast for your office, and how the appointee will work with organisations.
Okay, so we've had an opening. I'm glad you've spotted that. So most of the team is hired, and we've had a maternity cover actually there. So we have had a geographic lead in place, and then knowing that she's due to go off on a maternity leave, we've just hired someone. I think we're still doing security checks and a lot of that in the background, or I'd tell you the specific name, but we'll soon have someone who's covering that post, who's worked quite locally for many years, and I think will be very well versed in kind of understanding the lay of the land, which is exactly what we're looking for. We've got a policy team at the DA Commissioner's Office. We have small research teams, some comms, but one of the really key teams is this practice and partnerships team, which are sitting kind of in different geographical locations. And Georgie Hagan is our head of practice and partnerships. And the idea is to really build much more kind of local understanding, local networks, because I feel that's what's most missing at the national level in conversations. And so that's one of the ways we've tried to structure the office, so that we have a lot more influence in our policy work, but also in the way that we can bring people into conversations from the local level, so that we see a lot more conversation about how things are actually being implemented, what really is going on. Sometimes we talk ourselves into, at national level, things are going really well and everything's fine, and I think we need more conversations about how things are being implemented, and that's partly why those roles are in place. So I'd encourage any of you, again, I'll try to put some of this in the chat, to be in touch with our leads and allow them to understand your services and get to know you, and that would be a great benefit and result for something we could all do today. So I'll try to stay and put some of this detail in the chat if that helps.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you so much for making the time to be here today. We all know how incredibly busy you are. And thank you to all of our panelists as well today for giving up their time so generously. And of course, thank you to everybody who attended. I think we have 118 participants right now, which is really astonishing. And I'll hand back over now to Rebecca Gill from Rosa to wrap up this morning's session.
Thank you so much, Sirin. And once again, thank you to all the panelists today and the audience. It really has been brilliant to hear from you all and to really understand the challenges so many of you have faced over the last 15 months. You'll see in the corner of the screen, or on my screen it's in the corner, that Katie Chappell, who is live illustrating the conference, is showcasing what she's done so far, and we just wanted to give you an insight into what she'll be working on over the next couple of days. And to say that this session is ending shortly, and then the next session will start at 11:30. So, and thanks must go to Sirin as well for chairing this session so well. It's good to be doing it on Zoom, but it's a very different way of working. So it's great that we could have your help today. So thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Cheers then.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. See you.